The roar you hear from the Colosseum is not for a hero. It is the sound of 50,000 people baying for the blood of a man who is, for all legal purposes, already dead. Forget the image of a noble rebel fighting for freedom. The first and most important truth of the gladiator is that he was not a person. He was an investment, a piece of meat, a commodity. We know this because of the chillingly specific legal documents they were forced to sign, a contract known as the Auctoramentum. This wasn't a recruitment form, it was a suicide note signed in advance, a document that stripped a man of his humanity and turned him into property. What you are about to discover is the story of this contract, a story built not from Hollywood scripts, but from the skeletons in their mass graves, the desperate graffiti they scrawled on Baroque walls, and the cold, bureaucratic records of the men who profited from their deaths. This is the truth of how the Roman Empire, the most sophisticated civilization of its time, perfected an industry of human suffering, turning state-sanctioned murder into the most popular form of entertainment the world had ever seen. The man in the arena wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting to prove he was a worthy asset in a portfolio of death. So, who were these men, dragged in chains to the arena floor? They were not a legion of defiant rebels. They were, overwhelmingly, the refuse of the Roman world, swept from the dark corners of the empire and funneled into the meat grinder of the games. The primary source was the criminal justice system. Roman courts had a specific sentence, damnatio ad gladium, condemnation to the sword. These were the noxii, criminals deemed so worthless to society that their death was to be a form of public service, a bloody spectacle to entertain the masses. They were given a crude weapon and pushed into the arena with no training, meant to be butchered in the opening acts of the day. The next tier came from the battlefields. Prisoners of war, captured by Rome's relentlessly expanding legions, were considered property of the state. Instead of being left to rot in a camp, these trained soldiers, Gauls, Germans, Dacians, were a valuable commodity. They already knew how to fight. They were sent to the gladiator schools, the ludi, to be retrained in the art of killing for entertainment. Finally, there were the slaves. Men sold by their masters as punishment, or those who fell into debt and were forced to sell their own bodies into service. While a handful of free men did volunteer, driven by destitution or a desperate thirst for fame, they were the tiny, sensationalized minority. The vast majority of gladiators were men who did not choose their fate, they were sentenced to it. For the rare man who entered the ludus voluntarily, the process began with the ultimate act of self-degradation, signing the Auctoramentum. This contract was a masterpiece of legal dehumanization. By signing it, a free man agreed to become a slave. He swore a sacred oath to his new owner, the lanista, that he would submit, to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. He was, in effect, renouncing his right to his own life. The contract would specify a term, perhaps 3 to 5 years, and a signing bonus, a pittance for which he sold his soul. From that moment on, his life was no longer his own. He was legally an infamous, a person of dishonor, stripped of the civic rights a Roman citizen cherished. He could not vote, hold office, or even make a will. He had willingly descended to the lowest rung of the social ladder. Why would anyone do this? The answer was almost always crushing debt. It was a last resort for men who had nothing left to lose except a life they considered worthless. For the lanista, this contract was a license to control, to profit and, ultimately, to discard a human life as he saw fit. It was the legal foundation upon which the entire industry was built. The gladiator school, or ludus, was not the glorious training ground of Hollywood legend. It was a high-security prison designed for maximum control and efficiency. Archaeological remains of these schools, like the one in Pompeii, reveal the grim reality. Tiny, windowless cells arranged around a central training yard, all enclosed by high walls. The men were chained, fed on a strict schedule, and watched at all times. Their every waking moment was dedicated to honing their bodies into lethal weapons, not for survival, but for performance. The man in charge was the lanista. In Roman society, he was a paradox, a wealthy and powerful businessman who was, himself, socially despised. He was seen as a pimp for death, a merchant of human flesh. Yet, He held absolute, unquestionable power within the walls of his ludus. He was a prison warden, a slave driver, and a fight promoter all rolled into one. His word was law, and his punishments were brutal. The goal of the ludus wasn't to create warriors, it was to break men down and rebuild them into obedient performers, conditioned to kill and die on command for the entertainment of the crowd and the profit of their master. One of the most shocking and counterintuitive truths of gladiator life is revealed by their bones. For decades, they were known in popular slang as horderii, or barley men. Modern chemical analysis of skeletons from a gladiator cemetery in Ephesus confirms this was literally true. Their diet was an intentionally fattening, carbohydrate-heavy mush of barley, beans, and dried fruit. There was very little high-quality meat. But this was not a poor man's diet, it was a deliberate strategy. The lanista wasn't trying to build lean athletes. He was trying to create crowd-pleasing bleeders. A thick layer of subcutaneous fat over the muscles served two purposes. First, it protected the vital organs and muscles from superficial cuts. A slash across a fatty abdomen would produce a spectacular amount of blood without ending the fight prematurely. The crowd got their gore, and the lanista's expensive asset wasn't permanently damaged. Second, the bleeding itself was part of the show. The Romans were connoisseurs of violence, and a long, bloody dramatic fight was far more entertaining than a quick, clean kill. The gladiators were being fattened like livestock, their bodies engineered to provide a better spectacle when it was time for the slaughter. Training in the ludus was relentless and scientific. New recruits, called turones, began with a wooden sword, rudis, and a wicker shield, practicing endlessly against a wooden post called a paulus. They were taught by masters, often retired gladiators who had survived their careers. But they were not learning the efficient tactics of a Roman soldier. A soldier is trained to kill quickly and protect himself. A gladiator was trained to put on a show. The combat was a form of brutal theater, with specific, crowd-pleasing moves, parries, and strikes. This is why gladiators were divided into specialized classes, each with its own unique equipment and fighting style. The heavily armed Mirmillo, with his large shield and sword, was often pitted against the nimble Retiarius, who fought with only a net and trident. This asymmetrical warfare was intentional, creating a dramatic contest of strength versus speed. It was a performance. The trainers would drill into them the importance of dying well, to face their end with stoic resolve, to never beg for mercy. A good death was the final act of their performance, a last gift to the bloodthirsty crowd and a final mark of honor for the lanista school. In the suffocating violent world of the ludus, a strange and powerful paradox emerged, a deep sense of brotherhood. These men lived together, ate together, and bled together. They were isolated from the outside world, their only real companions being the other men sentenced to the same fate. Out of this shared trauma, they formed social bonds, creating burial societies called collegia to ensure their fallen comrades received a proper funeral and a memorial stone. These tombstones provide some of the most moving evidence of their humanity. Inscriptions read, "To Flamma, the Secutor, who lived 30 years and fought 34 times," or "To my dearest friend and comrade in arms, who died in his 8th fight." They formed bonds knowing full well they might one day be forced to face each other in the arena. This internal conflict, the need for human connection in a world that demanded they kill their own kind, is perhaps the most tragic aspect of the gladiators' existence. They were a family of condemned men, finding solidarity in the shadow of the Colosseum. Herein lies the central contradiction of the gladiator. In the eyes of the law and the Roman elite, he was filth, a social outcast stripped of all honor. Yet, to the masses and especially to the women of Rome, he was a rock star. He was the ultimate symbol of forbidden masculinity, a figure of terrifying power and raw physicality. The walls of Pompeii are covered in graffiti that attests to this dark celebrity. Celadus the Thracian, the heartthrob of the girls, reads one. Crescens the net fighter holds the hearts of all the women, reads another. This adulation went beyond mere graffiti. Wealthy, married Roman women would pay the lanista enormous sums for a night with a champion gladiator. It was the ultimate taboo thrill, sleeping with a man who was legally less than human but culturally a symbol of supreme virility. The The gladiator's sweat was even considered an aphrodisiac, scraped from his body after a fight and sold in tiny vials to women in the crowd. He was a monster to be feared, a slave to be despised, and a sex symbol to be lusted after, all at the same time. His body was not just a weapon in the arena. It was a commodity to be sold for pleasure in the bedroom. The day of the games began with the pompa, a grand parade into the arena. The gladiators, dressed in elaborate robes, marched before the crowd, putting on a show of confidence they could not possibly have felt. The famous phrase, Ave, Imperator, morituri te salutant, Hail, Emperor, we who are about to die salute you, was likely not a standard greeting. The historian Suetonius records it being said only once, by criminals destined for a mock naval battle, not by professional gladiators. The reality was less poetic and more terrifying. Once on the sand, the psychological pressure was immense. The deafening roar of tens of thousands of spectators, the smell of blood and sweat, the knowledge that your life depended not just on your skill but on the whim of a fickle crowd. A referee, summa rudis, oversaw the fight, enforcing rules and ensuring the combat remained entertaining. This wasn't a lawless brawl. It was a judged event. A gladiator who was too passive could be whipped or burned with hot irons by arena attendants to force him into action. He was trapped between his opponent's weapon and the crowd's insatiable demand for violence. When a gladiator was defeated, disarmed, wounded, and on his back, the fight would pause. This was the moment of truth. He would raise a single finger from his left hand, a plea for missio, or mercy. The power to decide his fate now left the arena and went to the crowd, and specifically to the editor, the wealthy sponsor of the games. The editor would read the mood of the mob. If the gladiator had fought bravely and provided good entertainment, the crowd might wave their handkerchiefs and shout, "Mit! Let him go!" But if he had fought poorly, or if the crowd was simply in a bloodthirsty mood, they would give the signal for death. The popular image of thumbs down is a modern invention. The Roman signal was likely a thumb pointed into the throat, mimicking the act of stabbing. The editor, wanting to please the crowd he was trying to win over politically, would almost always abide by their wishes. In that moment, the economic calculation of the lanista was pitted against the bloodlust of the Roman people. More often than not, the bloodlust won. If the verdict was death, the victorious gladiator was expected to carry out the sentence. The defeated man was trained to accept his fate with dignity, to kneel and grasp his opponent's leg, offering his neck for the final blow. To die well was the final measure of a gladiator's worth. But Roman pragmatism did not end there. After the killing blow, an arena attendant dressed as Charon, the mythical ferryman of the dead, would approach the body and strike it on the head with a hammer. This wasn't ritual. It was a crude but effective way to ensure the man was truly dead and not just unconscious. There was no honor in the removal of the body. While a fallen soldier was carried off the battlefield by his comrades, a dead gladiator was dragged out of the arena on a meat hook through the Porta Labitinensis, the gate of death. His corpse was taken to the spoliarium, a stripping room, where his armor and weapons, the valuable property of the lanista, were removed. He was then unceremoniously dumped into a mass grave with the other dead from the day's games. Even in death, he was just a piece of used equipment to be disposed of. The gladiator embodies the darkest genius of Roman civilization, the ability to systematize, commercialize, and package extreme violence as mass entertainment. The games were more than just a spectacle, they were a powerful tool of social control. They kept the restless Roman mob distracted with bread and circuses, reinforced the idea of Roman power through ritualized death, and desensitized the population to the brutality required to run an empire. This legacy of consuming violence as entertainment has never truly left us. The Colosseum may be a ruin, but the psychology it catered to is timeless. We see its echoes in the blood sports that still exist, in the gladiatorial language we use for our athletes, and in the endless hunger for reality television that pushes human beings to their breaking point for our amusement. The gladiator's story is a chilling reminder that the line between civilization and barbarism is perilously thin, and that the roar of the crowd can be the most dangerous sound in the world. What other piece of our history do we sanitize to make it more comfortable? The truth is often buried, waiting to be unearthed.